Good morning, good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope you're having a fabulous day already. I don't know what's going on with my stand here. I'm running a little behind this morning just because it's that time of year, y'all, you know, when we have that layer of pollen on our vehicles. If you're in Florida, then you know that is the pollinating. It's a whole season. And if you're not in Florida, then you may or may not understand. It may come later, it may come earlier, I don't know, but it means waking up with sinus headaches and all kinds of silly stuff. In any case, if you're here, then you are either new to my page or you have been following on a regular basis. My name is Donna. I'm a mom, a nana, a girlfriend, a jazzerciser, runner, wellness advocate. I'm studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, which is where a lot of my revelations come from right now. But I'm not a counselor yet. I'm just working on it. And most of my experiences that I talk about on Wellness Wednesday are experiences that I've had as part of my lifelong journey with anxiety and depression. And just being kind of a people watcher, observer, and observing others. Not a lot of people assume because I'm studying counseling that I'm automatically diagnosing people, and I'm not, but I have always been an avid people watcher, and I've always been able to kind of pick up on nuances and patterns in conversations and mannerisms and whatever. And so I see a lot of it's easy to see anxiety and anxiety type behaviors in a lot of other people, possibly because I'm reflecting myself or just because it's kind of a takes one to know one type thing. In any case, if you're just stumbling on my page, welcome. And if you have been following me for a while, some of the things today may sound a little familiar, and that's okay, because here's the deal. Good morning, Miss Victoria. We learn by repetition, right? And much to most parents' dismay, we can tell our children the same thing over and over and over again. And then all of a sudden one day some perfect stranger says the same thing and they're like, oh, hey, guess what I learned today? And we're like, what? So repetition is important because sometimes we are not always ready to receive information. And then sometimes we can hear the same thing put a few different ways several times, and then all of a sudden it clicks. So, in any case, if you're here, let me know you're here. If you don't see this till afterwards, feel free to still comment, ask questions, whatever. We keep it politics free here as much as possible. And just let me know you were here. So, I started Wellness Wednesday because as I said, I've been in a lifelong journey with anxiety and depression. And if you've been following me for a while, then you know that last week we talked about assumptions. And those are the assumptions we make that keep us from having important conversations with other people. And you may or may not have done the challenge, which was to pick a conversation you've already had in your head that you've not actually had in real life. And to have that conversation, not barrels blazing or starting World War III, but hey, can I run something by you? Hey, I might be totally off here. So last week we talked about assumptions, but in terms of how other people are going to react if we try to have an important conversation. So my new term also started since the last episode, and it kind of sparked a continuation of this concept. So we're going to talk about that a little bit and how we psych ourselves out. But what this really turned into as I was working on it was kind of a culmination of the last 3 episodes. I did an episode recently called Under Pressure, where we talked about the undue pressure we put on ourselves. And I did one talking about how spring doesn't wait for perfect. And a lot of times we don't ever take the first step because of our overthinking. And then I talked about assumptions in regards to what we assume other people are thinking or how we assume they're going to react. And so we never have the conversation. So you can see there's kind of a theme here, and it wasn't intentional, but sometimes these little mini series kind of develop. And today is no different because today, as I said, is kind of a culmination of that. We're going to talk about psyching ourselves out, how we psych ourselves out. So some of this is going to sound familiar, and that's okay, because sometimes just putting it a different way or just hitting you at a different time, in a different mindset might be what makes it stick. And hopefully for me too, right? So psyching yourself out basically is when your own thoughts sabotage your confidence before reality ever gets a chance. Okay? Similar to what we were talking about last week when it came to conversations, we make assumptions about how people are going to respond to certain ideas or thoughts or expressing our emotions. And sometimes we never even have the conversation because we already think we know how it's going to go. Hence my tagline when I went live this morning, which was, you took that crystal ball back out, didn't you? We put it away last week and now we've got it back out. Magic 8 ball, whatever you want to call it. We are predicting what's going to happen before it even starts. And this time it's not necessarily about a conversation. This time it's more about how we're going to do, how we're going to perform. So again, psyching ourselves out means undermining our own performance or confidence through overthinking, intense anxiety, and negative self-talk. Sound familiar? It's funny because it comes into play in a lot of different ways when it comes to wellness, in general. So if you've ever heard of the self-fulfilling prophecy, now that's a phrase we don't hear a lot anymore. It was rampant when I was younger. That's typically where we think, layman's terms, typically where we think or talk ourselves into failure, bad behavior, etc. And examples of this might be like, I'm a great typist, and I'm really good with words, but if you put somebody over my shoulder like a boss, all of a sudden, and let me know if this has happened to you, all of a sudden it's like you have a brain cramp and you forget what you're supposed to be doing, or you forget the things that you know just kind of automatically. So if I had somebody looking over my shoulder, I would all of a sudden get nervous and I couldn't type and I couldn't do it without making mistakes and I would be at a loss for words. So that's kind of an example of how this can happen, more mistakes, brain freeze. And then the other side of self-fulfilling prophecy is usually something like, everyone thinks this, so I might as well be that or do that or whatever. We're going to touch on that second one in another episode. Today's not the day. Right now I want to talk about how we can literally psych ourselves out of things we're perfectly capable of before we even get started, because of the way we get in our own heads. So I have a couple stories about this. I know, big shocker. But the stories, y'all, the stories are part of examples of how I've experienced this, and hopefully some of them are relatable or at least funny. So my very first half marathon, I want to say was not my very first half marathon, my second half marathon, I think. This particular half marathon was in St. Petersburg. I trained perfectly for this half marathon. Physically, I was ready to go. I did all of the training mileage. I improved my time and my pace and my performance through the Florida summer in the dead heat, which was huge because when you can improve under those conditions, then once the weather lets up a little bit, the humidity lets up, it cools off a little, then you should be good to go, presumably. So I was beautifully trained for this half marathon. And I went down and I stayed with my brother who was busy with work and went out with some friends. He already had some plans before he agreed to let me stay at his place. So he just kind of disappeared for the evening and he was gone all night. And then other family members weren't able to make it for one reason or another. And essentially what happened was I got in my own head. Again, I was perfectly physically trained for this event. I was trained to do my first PR, to do another PR or whatever, and just do really well. But I got into my own head. And by mile 2, I was stopping to walk. Everything felt heavy. My brain, my heart, my legs. I was mad at myself. I was mad at everybody else. And I literally, despite my training, good morning, Miss Dawn. Despite my training, I had literally psyched myself out of the whole thing. I failed in that half marathon before I ever hit the start line because of how I was in my own head, despite my training. Good morning, Miss Heather. So that's an example of how we can, we've already talked about how we can psych ourselves out of having important conversations. This is an example of how we can put in the work and still psych ourselves out of the performance. You know, again, that's a half marathon for me. It might look like something else for you, planning an event, whatever. And then the other story I have was when we were having, if you've ever watched Magic Mike, raise your hand. We were having a local Magic Mike event. No, it didn't include Channing Tatum, or Tatum Channing. I always get his name backwards, or any of those guys, but it was basically a tease show, if you will, at a local place. And I bought tickets for me and a good friend of mine. And we went, and we were excited. We thought it was going to be really cool. But I got into my own head, and I started freaking out about who was watching, and getting weird about the, as I started watching them on stage, especially when they would call audience members up, I started getting a little weird about, I don't know about being close to strange guys. I don't know about being touched like that. And I mean, it wasn't anything terrible. It was what you would expect from that type of Chippendales Magic Mike show. In any case, by the time we did in fact get called up on stage. And of course, I was still suffering some pretty good social anxiety at the time. By the time I got called up on stage, y'all, I was so inside of my own head, I could not relax and enjoy it. I was stiff as a board on that stage. The pictures were hilarious because everybody else was laughing and smiling. I looked petrified. So again, another example of how we can get inside of our own heads, and we can think we're prepared for something, and then we convince ourselves last minute, whatever, just before. It's kind of like the dress rehearsal for whatever it is. We can convince ourselves that this is just not going to happen the way we've trained, the way we've prepared, whatever. And this can apply to a lot of different things. So how did I end up here? How did I end up with this unexpected sequel to last week? Well, my new term started, like I said, on Monday, and the class opened up on Friday. We had a lot going on around here. We had some family here. We were pet sitting for somebody. So there were extra bodies in the house. There was a lot of activity. It was my grandson's last weekend, flag football championships. They took home a ring, by the way. Woo! The class opened up on Friday, and in and around all of my other things I had going on, I got to look at the syllabus. Now, this is a fairly normal occurrence for me. I will get in there. I will look at the syllabus. I will look at the assignment requirements. I will look at whatever welcome introduction video post the instructors put up. And by the time I walk away from the computer, I have convinced myself I either need to skip a term, or I need to ask for a new instructor, or whatever, because I'm so intimidated by the syllabus that I've convinced myself I'm going to fail the class before I even actually start. Of course, it doesn't help, especially in this case with this particular class, when part of the instructor announcements were, oh, hey, by the way, you may see grades lower than you're accustomed to in your history of academia. And I looked at my boyfriend and I read that out loud, and I was like, what does that say to you? And he's like, it says you're not going to get an A. And of course, we've already talked about this with me. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I'm immediately stressed out, and I'm immediately like, what am I doing? This assignment's due when this big event that I'm doing is going. I'm glad you remember, Dawn. But unfortunately, this kind of thing can happen even when we're not in college. It may not be a syllabus, but we may look at a job description that we are perfectly qualified for. And then when we see the details, or we start getting ready for the interview, we fall apart, like I did in that half marathon, because all of the sudden we're like, oh no, this isn't going to work out. I'm going to fail. Holy crap. And that's really what it boils down to. So, like I said, by the time I got done digging through the course, when the course room opened on Friday, I'm like, I'm going to fail this class. I'm glad I didn't get last term's teacher, but now I kind of wish I had last term's teacher, because at least I knew what to expect. And oh my goodness, she's going to be a hard grader, and blah, 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 blah. You know, all these things going on in my head. And, again, and I think I've said this before, I've never been the type of person to research a teacher ahead of time, request specific teachers, change teachers, anything like that. So as much as I'm thinking about it, because now I'm dealing with the devil you know versus the devil you don't know type situation. And I've been wishing for 2 terms that I had a different instructor, and now I have one, and I'm like, but my brain at the same time is like, no, you've never done it before. You're not going to do it now. You're just going to plug forward. And so something similar happened to me when I took my ethics and legal course. I thought I hated ethics and legal based on my last experience with it when I was studying for my bachelor's. I found it boring and uninteresting. Well, something had shifted. So I had myself all psyched out before that class started as well when I saw the syllabus and the announcements and the blah, blah, blah. And within the first week of the class, Dawn, I've never done it. I've always just taken the roll of the dice. And I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's too late to say. I have sometimes researched them after the fact, just because I'm like, what is this person thinking? In any case, so when I took ethics and legal, I totally expected to be bored, for it to be painful. And I got like a week into the class and I'm like, this is actually really cool. And I understand this better than I did when I was studying my bachelor's, because I had done different things at work in between then that had put me more out in the public face, more in the public arena, more dealing with legislative stuff and grassroots advocacy and whatnot. So all of it was actually making sense, and I was kind of finding it soothing, kind of like math when I was studying my AA. That's another story. So again, same thing this term is foundations of addiction. I'm looking at the syllabus, I'm looking at the teacher announcements, and I'm terrified. And then yesterday I dug into the first chapter of the class and the first readings and the first video, and I'm just like, wow, this is really cool, and I'm engaged, and I'm interested, and all of a sudden it's not as scary, even though I do have assignments due when I don't want them to be, but it's not as scary. So you kind of get the idea of where I'm going with this. Why do we do it? Why do we do this to ourselves, and why does it matter? And again, spoiler alert, you've heard these messages before. We talked about it with Under Pressure, and I'll drop that episode in the comments. We talked about it with the Spring Doesn't Wait for Perfection. This is all, unbeknownst to me at the time, this is all kind of culminated into this one episode. So why do we do this, and why does it matter? Well, it's the same message over and over again. And I mentioned that repetition. Sometimes we have to hear it many times. The pressure we put on ourselves to be perfect, the assumptions we make about other people and other situations, and that negative self-talk, imposter syndrome, catastrophic thinking, all of these are related to anxiety, self-doubt, and sometimes trauma response. It's also a procrastination technique. So when we do this and we start getting inside of our own heads and we're like, what if that happens? And what if that happens? And I don't think I can do this. And we're over practicing talking you off the ledge. Yeah. And that's actually part of the reason, Dawn, that I dropped to one class per term, because sometimes that one class per term with everything else I have going on puts me on the ledge. So now I'm going to poke you when I have that problem. So it is a procrastination technique. I talked about this before, about the learning to sow. When we get inside of our heads and we start focusing more on the results and the outcome than on the process, we sometimes don't even get started. Most commonly, in this case, it occurs in high stakes settings, like an interview, a first date. I know you're like, is a first date really high stakes? It can be. I've told you all many times about that date where I was pacing in the foyer because my social anxiety was at an all-time high, and I was trying to figure out how to escape the situation without anybody seeing me. So most commonly, again, this occurs in high stakes settings like interviews, performance situations, event planning. If you're planning an event and it's almost time for the event, as is the case with me right now, first dates, sales calls. This is another place where it happens. If you're in sales, the first thing that comes to mind here is Tommy Boy. If you've seen it before, you know the scene where, even sometimes if you haven't seen the movie, the scene has been circulated and quoted so many times, where Tommy's in the restaurant and he wants wings and the server is like, no, the kitchen's closed. And in previous sales situations, Tommy has just gotten really awkward. He set some guy's model car on fire in his office. He just gets really awkward and kind of in his own way, but it's Tommy Boy and it's Chris Farley, so he does it in a physical way instead of the mental way that we usually do. But then in this restaurant, when he wants the wings and he starts explaining to the server how his day has been, and it does get a little weird and awkward, but it's different. And he's like petting his roll, and he's like, my pretty little pet. And this scene has me in stitches every time. But anyway, you get the idea, because now he's in a more relaxed situation. The stakes aren't as high, and his natural talent starts to shine through. And the server ends up, she's like, you are weird. And she goes and says, I'm gonna fire up the fryer and put some wings down for you. So he gets what he needs. So those are the kinds of high stakes things I'm talking about. You may not initially think of a sales call or first date or an interview as high stakes, but a lot of times it can be. And that's where we tend to, when we feel like we're in a high pressure situation, that's where the term choking or punting sometimes comes into play, because we've gotten inside of our own heads, and regardless of our training and regardless of our preparation, we convince ourselves it's going to go straight to hell in a handbasket. And then we set ourselves up for failure, because we start doubting ourselves, and we get weird and we get awkward and we start stumbling. This is also akin to analysis paralysis, which I mentioned in the Spring Doesn't Wait for Perfection episode, where we overthink something to the point that we never even actually act. Or again, as I said, we get focused on outcome versus process, or what others will think. And so we never get started. In my activewear business, a lot of times I would kind of get in my own way. I'd be afraid to ask somebody that they would think it was stupid, or that they would, whatever. So I would never have the conversation. But this a lot of times is less about the conversation, more about taking action, which sometimes can be the conversation. So when we do this, why is it a problem? It's because when we do this, we destroy our own confidence and motivation. We avoid or procrastinate, and then we can suffer effects both mentally and physically. On the mental side, we compound or produce or ramp up our own anxiety, depression, rumination, hopelessness. And on the physical side, we can experience insomnia, loss of appetite, and things like that over this, to the point where we impair our own performance, even if we were well-trained, well-prepared, whatever the case may be. And that becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy where we've convinced ourselves we're going to fail. And so we now start making mistakes and stumbles that cause us to fail. And we do this because we've created mental blocks. So I hope that makes sense to you. Now, how do we stop? Well, again, some of these things may sound a little familiar, because honestly, when it comes to dealing with anxiety and overthinking and trauma responses and things like that, a lot of the same things overlap, and it's going to sound like the same answers all the time. And that's where some of that repetition until it clicks for us comes in. One of my favorite things in this case is to name the fear. Saying it out loud often takes the power away. In fact, recently, I was producer on a Zoom presentation from a young lady by the name of Jordan Salzano out of New York. She is an author. She's just self-published her second self-help book. And she does a little bit of motivational speaking, but she's also got autism spectrum disorder, and she's diagnosed with OCD. And one of the things she talks about in terms of her OCD is to speak intrusive thoughts out loud. Because when you hear them out loud in your own voice, it often changes the perception of how they sound. Sometimes it illuminates their silliness or their falseness, and you realize that those thoughts are ridiculous. And the same thing applies here. Naming the fear, naming out loud what you're afraid of. And I've done it before because I spend plenty of time talking to myself. That's what happens when you work and school from home. Naming the fear or saying it out loud, you realize, you're like, wait a minute, what? That sounds ridiculous. What am I worried about? And I've done that a few hundred times. So naming the fear, naming the thought, the intrusive thought, whatever the case may be that applies to you, there's a lot of power in it because it takes the power away from what's going on in your head. Reframing. I've given lots of tips about how to reframe things, but this is actually one of the best examples I've ever seen. It comes from a blog or an article by a young lady by the name of Sonia Satra. And the reframing in this case is when you're on your deathbed and you're looking back over your life, is this moment, is this thing that you're afraid of, this event, this performance situation, is it going to matter when you're on your deathbed? Are you going to remember it? And that to me was powerful, because we've talked about things like this before. Reframing. I've often said, instead of saying what's the worst that can happen, what's the best that can happen? That was a little word change out that I learned a few years ago. But, you know, we've talked about, is this going to matter in 5 minutes? Is it going to matter in 5 months? Is it going to matter in 5 years? But when you mentally put yourself on your deathbed, and is this going to be something that stands out after 60, 70, 80 years of life? That was huge and powerful for me. And then another blog called yesandyes.org echoed the statement by saying, basically realizing that the world is not going to end. And sometimes that's what happens, is we have to stop ourselves and say, if I fail at this, because sometimes if we open up instead of convincing ourselves that we're going to fail, if we open up ourselves to the possibility that we're going to fail, and then be like, what's the worst that can happen? Is anybody going to die? And I know that sounds morbid, but it's true. Is anybody going to die? Is the world going to end? Is anything going to explode? Those kinds of extreme things. And once you put it in that perspective, you're like, okay, I may be overreacting, overthinking, just going crazy over this when I don't need to be. Because it does, when you look at it from a macro level, instead of that micro in your face, kind of like forest versus trees, when you look at it at that macro level, all of a sudden it seems a little less intense and a little less scary. And then another suggestion on that same note of reframing was don't use don't. And that was Miss Sonia Satra again. Let me find that exact quote where they were talking about, watch, I'm not going to find it because I'm under pressure. They were talking about not using the word don't. And I can't find it now. You see, I had it pulled up here so that I was ready to go. But basically, instead of I don't know how to do this, change those words, change the don'ts, change the can'ts, shift those words, because as we've also talked about many times before, your brain looks for evidence of whatever you're telling it. So if you're telling it you can, your brain starts looking for evidence that you can. If you're telling it you can't, then it starts looking for evidence to prove that point. So speaking of evidence, you know what? I think I had the wrong, it was this Sonic blog. Hang on. I just figured that out. The don't thing. I want to go back to that for just a second. I might still not find it, and I might just have to move on. Yeah, what not to do. What not to do. Avoid words like don't. Don't play the chorus too fast this time if somebody's about to conduct a concert. Hey, Nick, you can always go back and watch from the beginning once I'm done. There's no restart button at the moment, but it'll be here for 30 days for you. So instead of don't play the chorus too fast this time, in this example that they give, instead say something like be mindful of the tempo during the gig. Now, Nick here, who we also call Cash Hole, there's a whole story behind that, has been doing some acting. From what I hear, he's really good. I have, sadly and embarrassingly enough, I have not been to see him yet. So he probably understands some of this performance anxiety that turns into, I don't know if I can do this, that kind of gets maybe a little self-degrading there. But the point here is to avoid words like don't. Instead of don't play the chorus too fast, say be mindful of the tempo during the gig. Now, do you hear the difference? That's basically the same thing, but it's changing that one word. It's changing that don't. It's changing that can't. It's changing that I got to go to work today to I get to go to work today. It changes the tone and tells your brain to think more positively, and sometimes that can make all of the difference. Okay, so now, again, your brain looks for evidence of whatever you're thinking. So if you're thinking, no, this is going to fall apart, I'm going to fail, this is terrible, your brain's going to find evidence to prove that point. If you're thinking, Yes, I can do this. It's going to be fine. I'm well prepared. Again, your brain is going to look for evidence to prove that point. So what can we do about that? Well, we can start an evidence file. And I've talked about this before too. I've talked about evidence files many times. I actually finally started a physical evidence file on my computer where I started putting positive feedback from instructors. So that when I have those meltdowns, when I'm working on a paper and I've been working on it for 2 weeks and I finally convinced myself it's complete crap, but I don't have anything left up here, I go back to those evidence files and remind myself of why it's not complete crap and why it's going to be fine and why it's still some of the best writing I've ever done. And we can do that with all the things like planning events, acting in plays at the local theater. And yes, Nick, I'm now using you as an example. We can do that with any of those things because, again, brain looks for proof. So start that evidence file, whatever it looks like. File things away, whether it's a written file, whether it's a portfolio where you're taking examples of work you've done, whatever that looks like, it's an evidence file. Start building evidence that builds your brain and your confidence and your feelings about your ability to do things up. And also remember that you have a lot of strengths. So if this doesn't happen to be one of them, or if you happen to fail in this moment on this particular strength, that doesn't define you. You've got all these other strengths and they're all really important. And they all play a part in who you are. So that brings me to practice and repetition, because practice makes perfect, right? And the more we repeat, as I've said before, the more we repeat, the more we practice, the more we do the things, the more apt we are to do it successfully. But you can overdo that. And I myself have had to learn how to walk away from things. For example, I have rehearsed speeches that I was going to do in front of the public, so much so that they were memorized. I didn't need any notes, but I also sounded like a robot. I also sounded like I was reading from a teleprompter because I had each word so particularly thought out. As you can see, I don't do that with Wellness Wednesday, totally on the fly. This is a more natural way to be. So you can't over practice and you can't over repeat until the point where you come off as robotic instead of authentic. And that makes a difference. And the most importantly here in the practice and repetition is the things that you know work, do them over. We mentioned that in the last few weeks too. Keep doing the things that you know work. Get rid of the things you know are not working. Or if you're not sure they're working, maybe test them one more time and get them out of there. So practice and repetition, very important, but you can't overdo. And that means that you have to know when to walk away. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Do it in secret until it's done. This is a quote. I've heard it many, many times. In this case, I pulled it from a young lady by the name of Marissa Mohi, but we've seen this and heard this many times before. Do it in secret until it's done. Here's why. Because if it is something you can do in secret until it's done, then you don't have that same interaction of worrying about what other people think interfering with you in the process. You're focused on the process, not the outcome. It makes a huge difference. And there are a lot of motivational speakers, mentors, anybody like that are huge subscribers to keep it a secret till it's done. You know, just because social media says so doesn't mean we need to announce it to everybody what we're up to. We can be quiet about it until it's completed. And sometimes that takes some of that additional pressure off of us. And just remember that depending on your personal beliefs, you are the only person you're really accountable to. At the end of the day, you are the only person you're really accountable to, depending on your individual beliefs. In my case, I believe I'm accountable to me and to God. Again, depending on your beliefs, but keep that in mind. There's a Forbes article that talks about focusing on 3 key points or objectives. So whatever it is you're dealing with, whether it's training for a half marathon, performing in a play, or planning an event, or whatever the case may be, whatever that looks like for you and the things I've covered. Forbes talks about focusing on 3 key points or objectives. And basically that just means that those are the things you focus on and you keep pushing the other things. In the case of a half marathon, that focus might be making sure you hit a certain number of miles a week, making sure your recovery is good, and making sure you're eating and hydrating well. Those are the three things you focus on. You don't focus on who's going to be there. You don't focus on what the time is going to be. You focus on doing the things that are going to get you there anyway, regardless. And that's something they teach in online business a lot, is if you do the things, the results come, instead of focusing on the results and psyching yourself out. So another thing that they talk about, and this one really blew my mind because I've not seen this before, and it was also echoed by Sonia Satra, was clench your left fist. And this was my huge, weird, odd takeaway for the day. Clench your left fist. And it says, although it might sound kooky, there's a line of research in neuroscience that offers significant support for the idea that right-handed people can strategically use fist clenching to manage how they absorb information, boost creativity, and perform during high-pressure moments. For example, clenching the right fist during learning activities activates the left ventral lobe in the brain, aiding the process of information. But by contrast, clenching the left fist encourages higher quality output, whether it's physical or creative. Never heard it before. I thought that was really stinking interesting. And in one study, researchers found that clenching the left fist enabled greater creative performances among subjects that was more in line with previous creative work. So you know what that means, right? That means my hand is going to be shriveled up because from now on, when I'm working on papers and all that stuff, I'm going to have my left fist clench. I'll let you know how it goes. And then, of course, finally, visualization. Tons of celebrities have used visualizations for years, and they credit a lot of their success to visualization. Jim Carrey visualized receiving $10 million for acting services before he became famous. There was actually something I saw that he actually wrote himself a check. And I've had mentors tell us to do that in business. Write yourself a check, the check you want to receive. The thing with visualization is you have to do it consistently, and you have to do it in a way that helps you believe that it's possible. You can visualize it all day long. No, visualizing a boat in your yard is not going to produce a boat in your yard. However, visualizing the actions that come, that lead to getting that boat, being able to afford it, being able to pick it up, bring it home, and the emotions associated with that may actually put a boat in your yard at some point. Michael Jordan is one of my favorite stories here because he's talked many, many times about how he visualized himself making winning shots over and over and over and over again, in addition to his regular practice, and that he credits that a lot with his success. So visualization, like I said, laundry list of celebrities, visualization is a thing that can work for a lot of people. And then, of course, one more thing that I'm going to go back to that I mentioned before is take a break. Know when to walk away. I have had papers where I was, even discussion posts where I was just stuck. And 3 hours later, I'm still staring at the same thing and I'm stuck. And I'm so intent that I want to get it done that day, that I got to finish it that day, whatever, that I have a difficult time walking away. But a lot of times when I walk away and I go back to it a day or 2 days later, all of a sudden it flows again. It's like the floodgates open again and it's done in like 10 minutes. Sometimes we got to take a break and know when to walk away, to give ourselves a little space, to give ourselves a little time, give ourselves something else to focus on besides whatever it is that we're focusing on. You have a great day too, Nick. So my challenge to you is a little different than usual. I know this one ran a little long. Just bear with me. My challenge to you is a little different than usual. Last week, I challenged you to pick a conversation you already had in your head and actually have it. This is a little bit different because I have talked about building evidence files many, many times in Wellness Wednesday. When I talk about imposter syndrome, when I talk about anxiety, when I talk about all these things. Today, or this week, I want you to start building your evidence file, whatever that looks like. If it's a folder where you put like a portfolio, where you put things in it that you have done to remind yourself of tangible things you've accomplished. Maybe you're a graphic designer. Maybe you're a quilter and you're struggling with a particular pattern. Maybe you're putting samples or pictures of previous things you've done in that folder. If you're in school like me, or you do a lot of administrative, academic type stuff, maybe it's a folder on your computer that has, PDFs of feedback or performance reviews or whatever. In Nick's case, since he's been doing some acting, maybe it's the playbills or the programs from the plays he's been in. But I want you this week to start your evidence file. Whatever that looks like for you. It can be written stuff. You can open up a notebook and write down 3 things that you've been resoundingly successful at. Like I said, or any of those other things I suggested. But that is my challenge to you this week, is to start your evidence file. And let me know. Drop a comment. Send me a message. What does it look like? Is it a digital file? Is it a physical file? What has it got in it? Let me know that you started it. And let me know what you plan to put in it as you go forward. Hopefully, you're gonna find some surprises when you start doing that. All right, so that's my challenge. So remember these things. Remember from last week, same thing. Stop operating on guesswork and put the crystal ball away. Stop trying to predict what's going to happen down the road and do the thing today. Start doing the thing. Stop trying to predict how it's going to turn out. And then also remember that you're not pizza or ice cream. So you can't make everyone happy and you can't make everyone like you. And at the end of the day, whatever those other people think, unless they're people whose opinions you truly trust and value, it doesn't matter. What matters is if you're doing what you feel called to do, what you feel capable of, and that you're building yourself up. And then stop asking what's the worst that can happen and start asking what's the best that can happen in a situation. And that's all I have. So I hope you found this helpful. I know it was a little bit long today, but not too bad. I did start a little late. If you did find it helpful, please share it. It will be up on YouTube within an hour-ish. And I'll drop the links to the previous videos that I referred to today in the comments in case you missed them. If you have a topic or something you'd like to see me cover, shoot me a message, drop a comment, whatever. Again, no politics. And I hope, like I said, go forward and start building that evidence file, because I think it's going to be a game changer for you on whatever you're struggling with. All right. Until next week, have a fabulous week and be well. Bye.